You're listening to the Mangino Talks podcast. I'm your host, Mangino. You can find me on social media everywhere: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. Just type in @Mangino Talks and you'll find me. My guest is Dr. Knowledge and Misinformation. Dr. Knowledge, knowledgeinanutshell.com is the website. The book is the all-time book of fascinating facts, and you can find him on Facebook and Twitter @Dr. Knowledge. Doctor, good to have you.
Always good to be with you, Mangino.
Hello, Misinformation. How are you, my dear?
And it's fun to be with you.
It's great to be with you, too. We'll check in with Misinformation with some interesting riddles and questions for you coming up a little bit later on. First, though, we'll talk with Doc about some of the content that's inside the book, the all-time book of fascinating facts. Doctor, once again, how many different factoids are there in this book?
Well, the book is 306 pages. We have roughly 2 stories per page, so we have roughly 600 fascinating stories.
Yes, and this is ultimately a lifetime of collections of fascinating facts that go all the way back, like the 4th of July and the presidents that died on the 4th of July, all the way back to when you were a teenager.
That's right. I've been collecting it all these years and sticking them on little pieces of paper in my pocket. And you should see my file drawer here. I have all these news stories that I tore out of newspapers, or in later years, things that came off the internet, or in the old days when we had teletypes. I still have some of the old sheets of paper that came through the teletype with news stories, that had really surprising, fascinating stories about them. It's amazing how many there are, really.
Was it difficult for you to narrow them down? Because you started off with different books first, books on sports and America and more. Was it difficult to ultimately condense them down to that number, those that make it, those that don't? And then obviously the final book, the all-time book of fascinating facts, to say, okay, these are the ones that make it and these are the ones that don't. How difficult was that?
Yeah, well, I just, tried to look, this is really amazing, this is really surprising, this is really interesting. And then I tried to have a variety so we didn't just always talk about presidents or geography or words or, I tried to get as much variety as possible. So a decision was made, do we put this in or do we not put this in the book? Mm-hmm. Really depended on, we don't want to have too many president stories. We don't want to have too many of this, too many of that. But some people aren't interested in sports, so we wanted sports stories in there, but we also didn't want too many. I just tried to get a nice variety to reach almost anybody's interest level.
When it comes to trivia, and this would fall under the category, would it not, of trivia?
Yeah, the word trivia used to have a different meaning. That all started to change with Trivial Pursuit, the game that came out in the 1980s, I think it was.
Yes.
And then Jeopardy's success on television, right, that they call it trivia. It used to be trivia meant it was a trivial stuff, but that's not true anymore. Trivia is really knowledge, and it's interesting knowledge.
Right.
And I think Jeopardy very much helped that, make that the definition for it. Yeah. So I never used to like to use the word trivia in the old days, but now I do, and I'm gratified. Somebody once, in fact, 2 people wrote us and said, this is the best trivia book of all time. That's where we got the title, The All-Time Book of Fascinating Facts. So it is trivia, but it's not trivial. It's, interesting things that, important things like, the story we told, 3 of the first 5 presidents dying on July 4th, right, which is just an amazing fact. And most people don't know that.
That's true.
And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be in school books, or kids don't learn it in school, which is really hard to understand, because that is such an amazing fact that, first of all, 3 of the first 5 presidents would all die on the same date to begin with, of unrelated causes. And of all the dates in the year, it would be July 4th. That's just incredible. So, we look for things like that, and we took just in our judgment were the best ones.
It's a great collection, and we're going to talk about some of the fascinating facts that are in the book. And how about if we start off with the Oscars? We just finished up award season in Hollywood. The Oscars, why are they called the Oscars?
It's a funny answer to that question. First of all, originally the Academy Award statues were simply called the Academy Award statues or statuettes. They didn't have a nickname. But the executive producer of the Academy, a woman named Margaret Herrick, was sitting at her desk one day, and she had a couple Oscars on her desk, and she looked at them, and this is in the middle 1930s, and she said, whoever made the little statuette, she said, that looks like my Uncle Oscar. She thought as she was looking at this statuette. And he was actually a man named Oscar Pierce who lived in Texas. Had nothing to do with the movies. He was a farmer and an insurance salesman. And she said, that looks like my Uncle Oscar. And so just to be funny, she started calling the statuettes Oscars. And Hollywood reporters who came to her desk heard her doing that, and they liked the idea of the statuette having a nickname. They were tired of writing all the time the Academy Award statuette. They loved the fact that she came up with this nickname of Oscar. So they started calling it Oscars. That's how it all started. And the amazing thing about that, Mangino, is that as it turns out that Oscar Pierce, first of all, had no connection with the movies at all, and yet the most famous movie award is named after him. And not only did he have no connection with the movies, he hardly ever went to the movies. He had no interest in movies. He was busy tending his farm and trying to sell insurance. And the last thing he was thinking of were the movies. And yet here the most famous movie award, as it turns out, is named after him, called the Oscar, named after Oscar Pierce.
That's a really good story. It really is. The next person on our list is Robert Lincoln. And immediately you may think, okay, what's the connection? Maybe it is back to the story that you told from the last episode where you have Lincoln and the Kennedys, and maybe it's a Lincoln with a Robert Bobby kind of connection there. But there is a tragic connection that Robert Lincoln has to three events in American history.
It's an amazing thing, Mangino. Robert Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln, was on the scene when 3 U.S. presidents were assassinated. Wow. We've had 4 presidential assassinations in our history. Robert Lincoln was there for 3 of them. Isn't that just incredible?
It is.
First of all, he was with his father, obviously, after Abraham Lincoln was shot. And then, as it turned out, that was in 1865. In 1881, by that time, Robert Lincoln had gone into politics himself and was in the cabinet of President James Garfield. And Garfield was leaving on a train trip from the Washington Railroad Station. The cabinet went to the train station with him because they had some final business to take care of. And Robert Lincoln was standing right next to President Garfield when a person described as a disappointed office seeker. He was a man who supposedly had been promised a job. Garfield didn't give him the job, and he was there with they didn't have Secret Service in those days. He comes there with a gun and shoots and kills President James Garfield. That was the second presidential assassination.
Wow.
And here Robert Lincoln is standing about 2 feet away from Garfield when Garfield was shot. And then, incredibly, exactly 20 years after that, in 1901, by that time, Robert Lincoln had gotten out of politics, went into business, was head of the Pullman Company, which was a big deal in those days with train travel. That was before airplanes. Mm-hmm. Train travel was the major method of travel. So he was president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce after his success in business. And President William McKinley, in 1901, was going to a business exposition in Buffalo and invited Robert Lincoln to come to the exposition, since Robert Lincoln was head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to come to this business exposition. And just as Robert Lincoln walked in the exhibition hall where this was going on, That's where a disappointed office seeker and described as an anarchist got in the receiving line, and they didn't have metal detectors in those days. He had a gun in his hand and tape wrapped around the gun to disguise it, and there was no metal detector to detect it. He got into the receiving line, and when he got to McKinley, he shot and killed President McKinley. And here's Robert Lincoln again, very close to this and witnessing a president's assassination. The funny part of the story, if you want to call it funny, is after that, Robert Lincoln vowed, and he said publicly, he would never again get anywhere near a president. And this was 1901. He lived till 1925 and never again, not only didn't ever get near a president again, but he never went to Washington, D.C. the rest of his life.
Wow.
He built a home, which is still there, by the way, in Vermont, in Manchester, Vermont. It's a big shopping area, and he had built a mansion there. He died in 1926, but that mansion is still there, and it is a tourist attraction. You can see where he lived, and he lived that long.
You can understand why he would never want to be around a president again. And you got to wonder to what extent that had an ongoing impact on him and just some aspect of guilt. Because if you're going to say, I'm not going to go and stand next to a president again because you're concerned what could happen to the next president, you also have to be living with some level of guilt about what happened to the three previous, including your own father.
There's one other story about Robert Lincoln that just blows the mind. He had gone to Harvard when his father was president, and he was coming home during a vacation from college. And, of course, in those days, everybody traveled by train. There were no airplane flights. So he was taking a train from Boston down to Washington to be with his family. And he had to change trains in Newark, New Jersey, and he was standing on the train platform waiting for his train to come. The platform was real crowded. People were pushing each other, and he got pushed off the platform right onto the tracks just as the train was coming. And nobody knows for sure if the train would have stopped in time or not, but a man saw what happened, that Robert Lincoln had fallen off the platform, was lying on the train tracks as the train was coming, and this guy rushed over, put his hand down, and pulled Robert Lincoln off the tracks. There's a question whether he could have gotten off the tracks and by himself that quickly, but this man helped him get off the track, and it probably saved his life. He many times later said this man did save his life by pulling him off the tracks. Right. And there was also a question whether the train would have seen him, whether the train would have stopped in time. Anyhow, the man who did that, the man who saved Robert Lincoln, his name was Edwin Booth. He was a famous actor of the day, a very famous actor of the day. He is in the Hall of Fame of Great Americans. He is the brother of John Wilkes Booth, the man who shot and killed Robert's father, Abraham Lincoln.
What a story.
A few years after. Isn't that amazing?
My goodness.
Our lives are just filled with stories like this, and we tried to, find, and I got to add this, we just had to double check everything. Some of these are just so, you just wonder, can that
They're
really
so hard
be
to
true?
believe.
Yeah.
Right.
But in all cases, and by the way, to prove the truth of this story, many years later, Robert Lincoln wrote a letter to Edwin Booth thanking him for what he did, and Edwin Booth always treasured that letter because he felt so bad that his brother had been the one to kill Robert Lincoln's father, and that letter is at the Smithsonian Institution, so that that does prove the truth of this story.
Wow, that's a great story. That is an amazing story, Robert Lincoln. Another story, clearly on the lighthearted side of things, the Super Bowl in American life is the preeminent event in our culture. It rivals the greatest of holidays, Christmas, when it comes to people who are going to gather together and be festive around an event. The Super Bowl is it. But it has a very interesting beginning. Not the championship of a league, but the way that the name of that event came about.
Would you believe I would say that's the most famous sports event we have now?
Yes.
You might argue the World Series is also in there, but certainly, no question, the Super Bowl is famous. Would you believe it was named not by any football executive or anybody, a journalist or anything? It was named by an 8-year-old girl. Her name was Sharon Hunt. And here's the story. We had two competing football leagues in the 1960s. The NFL, of course, the National Football League, and then there was a league called the American Football League, and they were bitter rivals going after the same players, and it was driving up player salaries. So the owners in both leagues decided the best thing would be to merge, which they did in the early 1960s. The American Football League merged with the National Football League, and that's now why you have the National Football Conference and the American Football Conference.
Mm-hmm.
So they merged, and one of the owners who was very active in bringing about the merger was a man named Lamar Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs in the American Football League. So they were going to have a championship game. The champion of the American Football League would play the champion of the National Football League in the season-ending championship game. And the question was, what were they going to call the game? Previous to that, the final game in the National Football League, the championship game, was simply called the National Football League Championship Game. That was the name. Not a very exciting name, but that's what it was. They were looking for a name like World Series, to define their championship game. So anyhow, on the committee of owners to come up with the name was Lamar Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs. He was the chairman of the committee to come up with a name for the championship game. And he's sitting in his living room one summer afternoon before the football season on a conference call with other owners on his committee to come up with a name. And they're talking about different names. What can we call this? Meantime, Lamar Hunt's little girl, or his daughter, 8 years old, her name was Sharon Hunt, is on the living room floor playing with one of the most popular toys at that time. This was in the middle of the 1960s. It was a black rubber ball that was real hard, and when you bounced it, it bounced up real high. And it was a big toy at that time, and it was called the Super Ball. And she's there on the floor bouncing this thing, the Super Ball, and she's listening to her father going through different names on the phone. And she very innocently looked up at her father as she's holding the Super Bowl in her hand, and she said to her dad, "Why don't you call it the Super Bowl?" And there was a pause there for a moment. He smiled, he laughed, and he said, "Oh, my daughter just said, why don't we call it the Super Bowl?" And again, there's silence. And the other guys on the phone said, "Hey, that's a pretty good name. This is a true story."
Yes.
And she is given credit for coming up with the name Super Bowl. They finished that phone conversation, then had a league meeting and adopted that name. So anyhow, to prove the truth of this story, I had heard that story, and when I was writing my first book on sports, I put that story in there. And it just so happened I was involved in the creation of World Team Tennis, and Lamar Hunt, in addition to owning the Kansas City Chiefs, also had a tennis tour. He had a men's tennis tour, and he was interested in getting a franchise in our World Team Tennis. We had a team here in Pittsburgh Triangles in that league. Anyhow, before the season started, we had a league meeting in Chicago, and I found out that he was going to be there because he was interested in possibly getting a tennis franchise in this league. And I managed at the league meeting to sit next to him. I waited to see where he was going to sit around the table. I went over and sat next to him. I just wanted to verify the truth of this story because I was putting it in my sports book, and I had a copy of the story in my breast pocket in my jacket. So we sit down, and I introduced myself, and we had a nice little chat. And I said, "By the way, I'm writing this sports book, and I just wanted to confirm this story." And I pulled the story out of my pocket and gave it to him. I said, and here was a story about Sharon Hunt hearing her dad talking to the other owners and playing with the Super Bowl. So I give him the story, and he's sitting there reading it, and I'm sort of holding my breath that he's going to say, yeah, this is actually. And all of a sudden, I see him take a pen out of his pocket, and he put a big X right in the middle of the story. And I thought, oh, my goodness, I must not have a right story. It must be a mistake. So he hands it back to me, and I said, you have an X here? And he said, yeah, you misspelled Sharon's name. It's Sharon. You have it spelled Sharon. That was what he put the X over her name, as if that was a big crime. But he verified that the story.
To him it would matter. That's the way you spell his daughter's name.
That's right.
Right. But what an amazing story, though.
Yeah, and I mean, he actually verified to everything about it, that it was true. His little girl was playing there with the Super Bowl, and that's why we have now the Super Bowl. That's
a great story, too. Yeah. Dr. Knowledge is with us. It's all from the all-time book of fascinating facts, whether you're talking about the Oscars, how they got their name, Robert Lincoln, and him witnessing the assassination of 3 presidents, and Sharon Hunt, how an 8-year-old little girl names the Super Bowl. Great stuff. KnowledgeInANutshell.com is the website. The book is the all-time book of fascinating facts. The phone number is
1-800-NUTSHELL.
1-800-NUTSHELL. Now time to check in with misinformation and misinformation. I'm looking for 5 of your best riddles.
5 of my best
5 of your best riddles to wrap up the show. What do you have for us?
Let's see what we have. Why don't ants get sick? They have antibodies. How do you put a spaceship to sleep? You rock it. What do you need to cook an alligator? A crock pot.
That's good, too. Last one.
And the last one is, once you've seen one shopping center, you've seen them all.
Misinformation joining us. Dr. Knowledge, one more time. The book is the all-time book of fascinating facts. You can find out more at knowledgeinanutshell.com. Don't forget about social media, Facebook and Twitter. They post on a regular basis at both of those social platforms. Dr. Knowledge is how you find them, and you can call 1-800-NUTSHELL. 1-800-NUTSHELL, and guaranteed either Dr. Knowledge or misinformation going to pick up the call. Doc, Miss, thank you very much for your time.
Great being with you, as always, Mangino.
Great having both of you. All right, make sure you continue to subscribe to Mangino Talks. Make sure that you find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Like the pages, follow the pages, share the pages, please, if you're enjoying what you're listening to. There's more to come. We do this every single weekday, Monday through Friday. Doctor joins us every other Friday at 3 o'clock. Looking forward to next time. I'm Mangino. You've been listening to Mangino Talks.